Things are in limbo. Nobody knows what to think. The economy could go either way, and nobody knows if they should be bullish or bearish. But I look at an enormously powerful statement that Jerome Powell said just a few weeks ago. He quoted Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Fed after Paul Volcker in the 1980s. He said pervasive uncertainty was the defining characteristic of the policy landscape.
So I'll start by remembering that Alan Greenspan famously said that pervasive uncertainty was the defining characteristic of the policy landscape.
We should remember that Alan Greenspan made those comments during what we think of now as the Great Moderation. That right there is actually the most powerful quote of Jerome Powell quoting Greenspan, or of any quote that Jerome Powell has quoted to us. This because of this quote, Jerome Powell hints at what he believes about inflation. Now, to understand this, you have to remember what the Great Moderation is. The Great Moderation is the last 40 years of disinflationary pressures that we have seen that have actually let us run inflation over the last decade before the pandemic at around 2% or even at 1.5%. And that was to the point where the Federal Reserve was actually considering reducing the inflation target to 1.7%. And that was because the idea of the Phillips Curve, which suggests when unemployment is low, you're going to create inflationary pressures. And that was a very accurate tool for determining inflation. Yet that ended up being very inaccurate, to say the least, or downright false. In fact, in the same discussion, Big Daddy Powell brought up the Phillips Curve and he said, maybe we've been looking at the wrong thing. Instead of looking at the Phillips Curve, we need to look at other aspects of unemployment to determine how much inflation we're going to have. So for a moment, if you're confused about what the Phillips Curve is, in its simplest form, it argues that the lower unemployment is, the higher inflation should be. So it's like a lever or a balance where if one side gets heavier, the other side goes up. So he is hinting that we might be at the next great start of the next disinflationary moderation that's driven by, say, technology and AI and better supply chains. This is actually very bullish for the long term. Part of the failure of what happened in the 1970s, and that failure that was so vastly different from the way things are today, is related to the wage price spiral. And that leads to a potentially unanchored wage price spiral. And most people have not actually experienced inflation in their lifetimes. People's expectations are wrong because right now people are feeling like, oh my God, inflation is going to stick around for a long time. So when we understand this, we can understand that in the 1970s, we had insanely different thinking. And I do mean insane here because we thought price controls would slow down inflation. Price controls are a way of saying businesses are price gouging. Let's just put a cap on how much they're allowed to charge for an item or how much they are allowed to charge for gas. And that'll stop inflation. Well, no, that fails because you create shortages and people have to pay with their time. Then price controls become so politically unpopular that you have to remove the price controls anyway. And then you'd have higher inflation than if you just let the free market just function. So then here in this piece by the New York Times, you would see that in the 70s and 80s, we thought that you needed to raise unemployment to fight inflation. This is significant because if you feel you need to raise unemployment to reduce inflation, you'll force an artificial recession, meaning that you created it without it happening via market forces, much like Paul Volcker did. Back then, we thought a good inflation target was 4%, but the reality is 2% was a much better inflation target. This way of thinking started from Greenspan's takeover, all the way back to the last 40 years, right up until 2020. All of this is deemed to be the Great Moderation. So is this going to happen again, and does Jerome Powell believe it will? It's hard to say for sure, but this has been a wild week. Like over the last 7 days, we've been receiving data that's been like all over the place. With the PCE report, personal income came in higher than expected at 0.4 versus 0.3. Year-over-year core PCE increased 4.6%, 0.1% less than expected. Month-over-month matched what was expected. It was an at expectations report and very good. When it comes to the GDP report, annualized at 1.4% was expected. It came in at 2%, which pretty much shocked everyone. Personal consumption was 4.2 versus the 3.8 that was expected, so beat again. GDP price index came in at 4.1 versus 4.2 that was expected, so good yet again. The jobs report was 239,000 for jobless claims and the expectation was 265. The number of people receiving benefits after an initial week of aid, a proxy for hiring, fell 19,000 to 1.742 million when we were expecting 1.765, the biggest drop in 20 months. All great news, but on the flip side, the manufacturing report was not good at all. The ISM numbers, the ISM Manufacturing Index, came in weak at 46 versus 47.1 that was expected. The 7th month of a contraction in a row, and anything under 50 is recessionary, so not good at all. Although the price index came in at 41.8 month over month, which is good, we definitely want prices to go down, but there is a faster rate of contraction, and all optimism about the second half of 2023 is weakening, which again is bad. Demand is easing rapidly, so the slowdown is happening, but it's only visible in certain areas. Very, very bad. Will the services sector be enough to pick up for the losses here? Many people believe so, but still it's unlikely. There are other things that aren't looking too good. Take the contraction of the money supply, for example. It hasn't happened since the last Great Depression. I actually made a detailed video about that just a couple days ago. Plus, the fact that falling revenues among Airbnb property owners is so significant that it could actually cause another housing market crash. I'll see if I can cover that topic on another video. And on that note, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe. Whenever I don't ask for a like in my videos, I can just get throttled by the algorithm. But leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts. Are you feeling optimistic about the economy, or are you feeling a little bearish? Personally, I'm right in the middle because there's so much information on opposite sides of the spectrum that I just don't know what to think. It could just go either way.